A boy born to a crown steps into a snare only a father could design. In 1483, courtiers praised his grace. He prized one thing more, his father's word. Edward IV read that devotion like scripture and rewrote it into policy. Letters forged, testimonies bought, enemies assembled out of rumour and wax seals. First to fall, a childhood companion offered to the ritual of duty at dawn. The Tower taught the rest, how to turn pain into evidence and silence into guilt. But behind a hidden panel, tidy stacks of plans told the unadorned truth. The sun was a tool. The door opened. The mask never returned. In a hall built for oaths, tears performed better than facts, and the verdict arrived on cue. Chains, damp stone, starving meals, teasing hope, visits that salted the wound. Winter slowly carved his body to the bone. Mind unspooled, memory argued with faith. When the man he called father came last, mercy did not. Power does what love will not, and explains nothing. This is not a legend. It is a manual on how trust becomes a noose. Watch a prince disappear as everyone applauds. Remember who lit the candles and who snuffed them. Richard of Shrewsbury. In the autumn of 1483, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury stood at the precipice of his 15th birthday, embodying every virtue that medieval nobility prized above gold itself. Tall for his age, with the distinctive Plantagenet features that marked him as true royal blood, Richard possessed an almost ethereal beauty that court chroniclers would later describe as angelic in countenance, yet bearing the bearing of a future king. His golden hair caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows of Westminster Palace, and his blue eyes held an intensity that spoke of intelligence far beyond his years. Yet it was not his physical perfection that made him beloved throughout the realm. It was his unwavering loyalty to his father, King Edward IV, a devotion so complete and absolute that it would ultimately become the instrument of his destruction. The bond between father and son transcended the typical relationship between monarch and heir. Edward IV, battle-hardened from the Wars of the Roses, saw in his younger son not merely a political asset, but a reflection of his own idealized youth. Richard hung on his father's every word with the fervor of a religious devotee, believing with childlike faith that his father's wisdom was infallible, his judgment divine. The political landscape of 1483 England resembled a chessboard where every piece harbored the potential for betrayal. The Wars of the Roses had left deep scars across the nobility, creating a web of grudges, shifting alliances, and barely concealed ambitions that threatened to tear the kingdom apart at the slightest provocation. In this atmosphere of perpetual suspicion and barely restrained violence, loyalty had become both the most precious commodity and the most dangerous liability. Young Prince Richard moved through this treacherous landscape with the dangerous innocence of one who believed that virtue and loyalty would be rewarded, that his father's protection was absolute and eternal. He failed to notice the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, the manner in which certain nobles avoided his gaze, or the increasing frequency with which his father's advisers spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. The sweet smell of fear that permeated the royal apartments went undetected by a young man whose trust in his father had blinded him to the gathering storm that would soon consume everything he held dear. The transformation began subtly, like poison seeping slowly through wine, almost imperceptible until the damage had already taken root in Richard's impressionable mind. King Edward IV, master manipulator forged in the crucible of civil war, understood that the most effective weapons were often those wielded by willing hands. In the private chambers of Westminster Palace, away from the prying eyes of courtiers and chroniclers, the king began his careful cultivation of his son's devotion, transforming natural filial loyalty into something far more dangerous and absolute. "The realm faces threats from every direction, my son," Edward would whisper during their private audiences, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern mixed with royal authority. "Enemies surround us like wolves circling a wounded stag, and only through absolute loyalty and decisive action can we preserve the crown for future generations." These conversations, which Richard treasured as precious moments of intimacy with his beloved father, were in reality carefully orchestrated sessions of psychological manipulation designed to prepare the young prince for the role he would unknowingly play in his own destruction. Edward IV possessed an almost supernatural ability to read men's souls and exploit their deepest desires and fears. He recognized in his younger son a purity of devotion that could be shaped and directed like molten metal in a blacksmith's forge. The king spoke of honor and duty, of the sacred bond between father and son, of the terrible burden of kingship that required difficult decisions and unwavering resolve. The first test came in the form of Sir Thomas Grey, a young knight who had served as Richard's companion and friend since childhood. Edward IV presented his son with carefully fabricated evidence of Grey's supposed treachery, forged letters suggesting communication with Lancey, Austrian agents, testimony from paid witnesses claiming to have overheard seditious conversations, and physical evidence planted in Grey's chambers by the king's agents. "This is your moment of truth, my son," Edward declared, his eyes boring into Richard's soul with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and doubt. "Will you allow sentiment and misplaced affection to blind you to the reality of treachery, or will you demonstrate the strength of character necessary to protect our crown?" For Richard, raised to believe that his father's wisdom was absolute and his judgment infallible, there was no choice at all. The execution of Sir Thomas Grey took place at dawn in the courtyard of the Tower of London, with Richard himself delivering the final blow that severed his childhood friend's head from his shoulders. As Grey's blood pooled on the ancient stones, mixing with the morning mist that rose from the Thames, Richard felt something fundamental shift within his soul, a hardening that he mistook for maturity, but which was actually the first stage of his spiritual corruption. The taste of blood, once sampled, proved intoxicating to a young man who had been taught to equate violence with virtue and cruelty with strength. In the months following Sir Thomas Grey's execution, Prince Richard discovered within himself a capacity for brutality that both thrilled and terrified him, though he carefully buried any doubts beneath layers of righteous justification and paternal devotion. The Tower of London became his second home, its ancient stones bearing witness to a systematic campaign of terror that would have shocked even the most hardened veterans of the Wars of the Roses. King Edward IV, observing his son's transformation with the cold satisfaction of a master craftsman, watching his creation take shape, began providing Richard with an endless stream of enemies to eliminate. Each new victim came with carefully constructed evidence of treachery, elaborate backstories of betrayal, and detailed explanations of why their deaths were essential for the security of the realm. Richard absorbed these justifications with the fervor of a religious convert, his young mind unable to comprehend that he was being systematically transformed into an instrument of his father's will. The torture chambers beneath the tower became Richard's classroom, where he learned to extract confessions from prisoners using methods that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud. The rack became his preferred instrument, its mechanical precision appealing to Richard's methodical nature. He would personally oversee the slow stretching of joints and tendons, listening with clinical detachment to the symphony of screams that echoed through the stone corridors. Lord William Hastings, once a trusted advisor to the king and a man who had bounced Richard on his knee as a child, became the prince's most memorable victim during this period of escalating violence. Accused of corresponding with Lancastrian agents in France, Hastings was subjected to a week-long ordeal that began with a systematic breaking of his fingers and progressed through increasingly elaborate torments designed to strip away every vestige of dignity and resistance. The psychological transformation that accompanied Richard's physical brutality was perhaps even more disturbing than the acts themselves. The young prince began to develop an elaborate internal mythology that cast himself as a righteous warrior fighting against the forces of chaos and betrayal. Each scream of agony became a hymn of justice, each broken body a testament to his unwavering loyalty to the crown. Yet through it all, Richard maintained his absolute faith in his father's wisdom and righteousness. Each act of violence was performed not from personal sadism, but from a burning desire to prove himself worthy of the king's love and trust. He had become the perfect weapon, sharp, deadly, and completely under his father's control, yet still believing himself to be acting from the highest and most noble motives. The revelation came like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, shattering Richard's carefully constructed world with the devastating force of absolute truth. In the spring of 1484, as the young prince basked in what he believed was his father's approval and the righteousness of his cause, a chance discovery in the king's private study would expose the elaborate deception that had consumed the last year of his life and transform him from willing executioner into helpless victim. It began with a simple errand. Richard had been sent to retrieve a particular document from his father's personal chambers while the king attended a council meeting. As Richard searched through the ornate wooden desk for the requested papers, his fingers brushed against a hidden compartment that opened to reveal a collection of documents that would destroy everything he believed about himself and his father. The first letter he read, written in his father's distinctive hand, was addressed to Master John Tiptoft and dated 3 months before Sir Thomas Grey's execution. In it, King Edward IV outlined his plan to eliminate potential threats to his reign by using his younger son as an unwitting instrument of terror. "The boy's devotion is absolute," the king had written, "and his willingness to believe whatever I tell him makes him the perfect weapon. Through him, I can eliminate my enemies while maintaining the appearance of reluctant justice." The second document was even more damning, a detailed list of names that included not only those Richard had already killed, but dozens of others marked for future elimination. Next to each name was a fabricated crime and a suggested method of execution, along with notes about how to present the evidence to Richard in the most convincing manner. Sir Thomas Grey's name appeared at the top of the list, with a notation that read, "Childhood friend, perfect test of loyalty, forge correspondence with Tudor agents." As Richard continued reading, the full scope of his father's betrayal became horrifyingly clear. Every piece of evidence he had been shown, every confession he had extracted, every justification for violence had been carefully orchestrated by the king and his agents. The prisoners he had tortured were not traitors, but innocent men whose only crime was possessing something the king wanted or representing some perceived threat to royal power. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating beyond measure. Richard's entire sense of identity had been built around his role as his father's loyal instrument, his belief in the righteousness of his actions, and his faith in the king's wisdom and love. To learn that he had been nothing more than a tool, manipulated and deceived into becoming a monster, shattered his mind with the force of a physical blow. The door opened to reveal King Edward IV, his weathered face immediately taking in the scene before him with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading guilt and fear in human expressions. When the king finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth and affection that Richard had treasured throughout his young life. "I see you have discovered the truth, my son," Edward said quietly, his tone as cold and emotionless as winter stone. "You have served your purpose admirably, and now it is time for you to serve in a different capacity." The transformation in the king's demeanor was complete and terrifying. Gone was any pretense of paternal love, replaced by the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. The arrest came at dawn, as such things always did, in the brutal calculus of medieval justice. Richard awoke in his chambers to find himself surrounded by armed guards, wearing the livery of the royal household, their faces hidden behind steel helms that reflected the pale morning light. The young prince offered no resistance, as heavy iron shackles were locked around his wrists and ankles, with the finality of a tomb being sealed. The formal charges, read aloud in the great hall of Westminster Palace before an assembly of nobles and court officials, painted Richard not as his father's loyal instrument, but as a rogue prince who had exceeded his authority and committed unspeakable crimes against innocent subjects of the crown. The herald's voice echoed through the vaulted chamber as he recited a litany of accusations that transformed every act of filial obedience into evidence of monstrous ambition and uncontrolled bloodlust. King Edward IV himself took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, his performance a masterpiece of calculated betrayal that would have impressed even the most cynical observers of court politics. With tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, the king spoke of his horror at discovering his son's true nature, of the sleepless nights spent wondering how he had failed as a father, and of the terrible burden of duty that compelled him to seek justice, even against his own blood. The public's reaction to the charges was swift and merciless. The same people who had once cheered Richard's name in the streets now bayed for his blood with the fickle cruelty that characterized medieval crowds. Stories of his alleged crimes spread through London like wildfire, growing more horrific with each telling until Richard had become a monster of almost supernatural evil in the popular imagination. The trial itself was a foregone conclusion, a carefully orchestrated piece of theatre designed to provide the appearance of justice while ensuring the predetermined outcome. As Richard sat in the dock, listening to his life being systematically destroyed by the man he had loved and trusted above all others, he experienced a psychological transformation that was perhaps even more profound than his earlier corruption. The verdict surprised no one in the packed courtroom. "Guilty on all charges," the chief judge intoned. "Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, you have been found guilty of high treason, murder, and crimes against the peace of the realm. The court sentences you to death, to be carried out at the king's pleasure. The crowd erupted in cheers of approval, their bloodthirsty roars echoing through the ancient hall. The cell that became Richard's final home was a masterpiece of calculated misery, designed not merely to contain, but to slowly destroy both body and spirit through systematic deprivation and psychological torture. Located in the deepest bowels of the Tower of London, the chamber was perpetually damp with moisture that seeped through the ancient stones and pooled in stagnant puddles on the uneven floor. The walls, blackened with centuries of accumulated filth and despair, seemed to absorb what little light filtered down from the single barred window set high above. The systematic starvation began immediately, with Richard receiving barely enough food to sustain life, but never enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger that became his constant companion. A single bowl of thin gruel, often contaminated with mold or crawling with maggots, was pushed through a slot in the door once each day, accompanied by a cup of brackish water that tasted of rust and decay. As the weeks turned to months, the physical transformation was horrifying to behold. Richard's once gold hair became matted and filthy, falling out in clumps to reveal patches of diseased scalp beneath. His skin, deprived of sunlight and proper nutrition, took on a greyish pallor that made him appear more corpse than living man. His clothes hung in tatters from his increasingly skeletal frame, providing no protection against the bone-deep cold that permeated the underground chamber. The psychological torture proved even more devastating than the physical deprivation. King Edward IV made regular visits to his son's cell, not out of paternal concern, but to twist the knife of betrayal ever deeper into Richard's wounded psyche. These visits followed a predictable pattern. The king would arrive with apparent reluctance, expressing sorrow at his son's condition, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative of Richard's guilt and the justice of his punishment. The cruelest aspect of these visits was the way the king would occasionally offer false hope, speaking of possible clemency or reduced sentences that might be granted if Richard would only confess his crimes and beg for forgiveness. These moments of apparent mercy were carefully calculated to raise the young prince's spirits just enough to make their inevitable crushing all the more devastating. Richard's mental state deteriorated rapidly under this sustained assault on his sanity. The absolute faith that had once defined his character was replaced by a corrosive mixture of self-hatred and desperate confusion. The isolation and sensory deprivation created a perfect environment for psychological breakdown, and Richard found himself talking to imaginary companions, reliving his crimes in vivid hallucinations, and experiencing moments of complete dissociation from reality. Winter's grip transformed Richard's cell into a tomb of ice. The Thames had frozen solid above, and frost crept along the stone walls like skeletal fingers. The prince, once strong enough to wield a sword for hours, had withered to bone wrapped in parchment skin. His eyes, which had once shone with faith in his father's wisdom, now stared from sunken hollows, reflecting only the fractured light of a mind undone. The rot that had been claiming him piece by piece finally overwhelmed his body's defenses. Infection spread through his flesh until the cell reeked of decay so profound that guards pressed herb-soaked cloths to their faces before descending. His extremities had turned black, the tissue dying while his heart still beat, each pulse sending agony through what remained of his nervous system. Edward IV descended one final time to witness his creation. He found Richard huddled in the corner, chest barely rising, tremors running through his skeletal frame. The king observed from the doorway with the clinical detachment of a physician examining a specimen. "You played your part perfectly," Edward said, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. "Your actions allowed me to destroy my enemies while I remained above suspicion. History will remember you as a justly punished traitor, not as my victim." Richard's lips moved, struggling to form words through cracked lips. "Father." The word emerged as barely a breath, carrying the weight of every betrayal, every moment of confused anguish. "Why?" Edward's mouth curved slightly. "Because your absolute trust made you useful. Because you loved me without question, and that love was a tool I could shape to my purposes. When death came, it arrived quietly, not as the violent spectacle promised by his sentence, but as a gradual dimming, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. As awareness faded, Richard found something that might have been peace. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but simply the end of pain. The morning guard discovered him still curled in that corner, features locked in an expression impossible to read, perhaps agony, perhaps release. The record stated he died of illness. One last lie to obscure the truth. They buried him without marker or ceremony in the tower's courtyard, where countless feet would tread over earth that held a prince who had loved his father unto death. Richard of Shrewsbury's fate remains among history's darkest lessons in the corruption of sacred bonds. Not content with mere execution, Edward IV had orchestrated something far more terrible, the slow unraveling of a son whose only crime was perfect faith. In the chronicles of royal cruelty, few stories match the calculated horror of a father who wielded love itself as an instrument of annihilation, transforming devotion into the very means of destruction. The philosophical implications of Richard's tragedy extend far beyond the specific circumstances of medieval court politics, touching upon fundamental questions about the nature of trust, authority, and moral responsibility that remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. How do we reconcile our need to believe in the goodness of those we love with the reality that even the closest relationships can harbor the seeds of betrayal? What happens to our understanding of justice when the very institutions and individuals we trust to protect us become the source of our destruction? King Edward IV's motivations remain a subject of historical debate, though the evidence suggests a complex mixture of political calculation and psychological pathology that defies simple explanation. Some historians argue that the king's actions were driven by the paranoid necessities of maintaining power in an unstable political environment, where the elimination of potential threats required extreme measures and the sacrifice of personal relationships to the greater good of dynastic survival. Others see in Edward's behavior the hallmarks of a sociopathic personality, a man capable of viewing even his own children as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded in service of his ambitions. The most disturbing aspect of the entire affair may be the way in which Richard's genuine virtues, his loyalty, his devotion, his willingness to sacrifice for what he believed was right, were transformed into the very qualities that made his destruction possible. In a world where cynicism and self-interest might have provided protection, Richard's purity of heart became his fatal weakness, exploited by a father who understood exactly how to manipulate his son's noble instincts for ignoble purposes. The legacy of Richard's tragedy extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death, creating ripple effects that would influence English royal politics for generations to come. The precedent established by Edward IV that even the bonds of blood could be sacrificed to political necessity would echo through subsequent reigns, contributing to an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that characterized the Tudor dynasty and beyond. The question of justice in Richard's case remains one of the most troubling aspects of his story. By any reasonable standard, the young prince was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy that destroyed his life through deception and manipulation. Yet the official records of his death list him as a traitor and murderer, his reputation forever stained by crimes he committed in ignorance of their true nature. This perversion of justice, where the victim becomes the villain in the historical record, represents perhaps the ultimate triumph of Edward IV's manipulation. In the end, the tragedy of Prince Richard of Shrewsbury forces us to confront some of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature and the exercise of power. It reminds us that evil often wears familiar faces, that trust can be weaponized by those we love most, and that innocence provides no protection against the machinations of those who view other human beings as expendable resources in their pursuit of larger objectives. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Richard's memory is not a monument of stone or bronze, but a commitment to vigilance against the patterns of manipulation and abuse that destroyed him. His story serves as an eternal warning that the price of freedom, both political and personal, is constant awareness of how power can corrupt even the most sacred bonds, and how the very qualities that make us most human can be turned against us by those who understand their power and are willing to exploit them without conscience or remorse. The ghost of Prince Richard stands as a sentinel in the shadows of history, reminding us that trust, once broken, can never be fully restored, and that the wounds inflicted by those we love most deeply are often the ones that never truly heal. In a world where such betrayals remain possible, his memory serves as both warning and witness to the terrible price that can be paid when love becomes a weapon in the hands of those who have forgotten what it means to be human.